Pet sitting might seem like an easy way to earn money, but sometimes it's far more than you bargain for. These three terrifying true stories reveal the dark side of a seemingly harmless job. Dare to listen until the end? Pet sitting had always been a comfortable job for me. A few years ago, I picked it up as a side hustle during college, and it quickly became my go-to way to earn extra cash. Spending time with animals, having a quiet space to study, and getting paid to stay in someone else's home, it seemed like the perfect arrangement, until I took a job that made me question everything. This particular gig came from a family I'd worked with before. They owned 4 cats, each with its own quirky personality, and lived in a large 2-story house with a finished basement. I had stayed there once before and had a vague memory of the basement being cold and strangely unwelcoming, but nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened. When the family contacted me about watching the cats for a week, I accepted without hesitation. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my mornings attending classes and my evenings relaxing at the house, feeding the cats and catching up on reading. My boyfriend even came over to keep me company a couple of nights, and everything felt normal until the 4th night. That evening, we were lounging in the guest bedroom, chatting about our plans for the weekend. Suddenly, my boyfriend stopped mid-sentence, his brow furrowed. "Do you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" I replied, pausing to listen. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I shrugged, brushing it off. "You're imagining things," I teased, but the look on his face told me he wasn't convinced. "I don't know," he said after a long pause. "Something about tonight feels off." I laughed nervously, trying to shake the sudden unease his words had stirred in me. "It's just an old house," I said. "Old houses make noises. You're probably hearing the pipes." He didn't respond, and after a while he said good night and left. I was too stubborn to admit it at the time, but I felt uneasy as I watched him drive away. That's when the first strange thing happened. I had been watching TV in the guest room, but just as I was about to turn it off for the night, the screen flickered. For a moment it turned to static, then back to the program I was watching. Confused, I checked the remote and the power cable, but everything seemed fine. Shrugging it off, I turned off the TV and lay down, determined to ignore the growing pit in my stomach. Moments later, the screen flickered again, this time turning itself back on, the volume blasting static. My heart leapt, and I scrambled to unplug the TV entirely. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. Deciding that I'd had enough for one night, I grabbed my blanket and pillow and relocated to the couch in the living room. The next evening, my boyfriend returned. I told him about the TV, expecting him to laugh it off, but instead, his unease deepened. "You should leave," he said firmly. "It's not worth staying here if weird things are happening." I rolled my eyes. "It's a house, not a haunted mansion," I said. "I'm fine." But later that night, as we sat in the living room, an eerie sound drifted up from the basement. It was faint at first, a soft, high-pitched crying that sent chills down my spine. My boyfriend froze. "What the hell is that?" I forced a laugh, trying to mask my own fear. "It's probably one of the cats," I said, standing up. "You know how they make those weird noises sometimes." "Don't go down there," he said quickly, his voice low and urgent. I hesitated, but the sound continued, tugging at my curiosity. "It's probably the youngest one," I said, trying to reassure myself as much as him. "He loves hiding in weird places." As I descended the basement stairs, the crying grew louder. "Here, kitty," I called softly, my voice echoing in the cold, dimly lit space. When I reached the bottom, the sound stopped abruptly. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding as I scanned the room. Everything was still. The furniture covered in sheets, the storage boxes stacked neatly in the corner. Then I spotted him, the youngest cat, sitting in the doorway of the spare room, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Relieved, I scooped him up and carried him back upstairs. My boyfriend didn't look relieved, though. If anything, he seemed more unsettled than before. "Let's just leave," he said again. But I didn't want to lose the job or disappoint the family. "I'll be fine," I insisted, though deep down I wasn't so sure. If this story gave you chills so far, don't forget to like and share the video. Let your friends know about this creepy tale. The night after the basement incident, I tried to shake the unease clinging to me like a shadow. I convinced myself it was all in my head, just a cat making strange noises amplified by an old house's creaks and groans. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. After feeding the cats and tidying up, I settled on the couch to watch a movie, keeping the lights on in every room. My boyfriend hadn't come back that evening, and for the first time in years, I felt uncomfortable being alone. It wasn't long before the crying started again. This time it was louder, clearer, and unmistakably coming from the basement. My stomach twisted as the sound reached my ears, a mournful wail that sent chills crawling down my spine. My first instinct was to freeze, to stay rooted to the couch and pretend I hadn't heard it. But the longer I sat there, the harder it became to ignore. Finally, I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling as I moved toward the basement door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in its place. I placed my hand on the doorknob, hesitating as fear warred with curiosity. What if it wasn't a cat? What if it wasn't an animal at all? Shaking off the thought, I opened the door and flipped on the light. The stairs stretched downward into the dimly lit space, their shadows long and distorted. The air was colder than I remembered, carrying a faint metallic smell that made my nose wrinkle. "Here, kitty," I said softly, descending the steps one at a time. My voice echoed back at me, the sound unnervingly hollow. The crying started again, louder and more desperate than before. It was coming from the far corner of the basement, near the spare room. My heart raced as I approached, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the corner, the sound stopped. I scanned the area, my eyes darting between the covered furniture and darkened corners. The room was empty. I turned back toward the stairs, my breath catching in my throat. All 4 cats were sitting at the top, staring down at me. Their eyes gleamed in the dim light, unblinking and eerily focused. "How did you—" I started, but my voice trailed off as the weight of the situation sank in. If all the cats were upstairs, what had been crying in the basement? I moved quickly, climbing the stairs 2 at a time and shutting the door firmly behind me. My hand shook as I locked it, the sound of the bolt sliding into place offering little comfort. The rest of the night passed in a blur of unease. I kept the TV on for background noise, hoping it would drown out the oppressive silence. Every creak of the house made me jump, and I found myself glancing at the basement door more times than I could count. The following day, I debated calling the family to let them know what had happened, but what would I even say? "Your basement is creepy?" It sounded ridiculous, and I didn't want to come across as unprofessional. By the time evening rolled around, I had convinced myself to stay one more night. After all, It was just a few more days until the family returned. I could handle it. At least, that's what I told myself. As darkness fell, I tried to distract myself with a book, the warm glow of the living room lamp casting comforting shadows on the walls. But as the hours dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't long before the crying began again. This time it was different. Louder, sharper, almost angry. The sound filled the house, reverberating off the walls and making my skin crawl. I stood frozen in the living room, my heart pounding as the crying grew louder. "No," I whispered to myself. "I'm not going down there again." But the sound didn't stop. It continued, relentless and piercing, until I felt like I couldn't breathe. Against my better judgment, I approached the basement door. "Who's there?" I called, my voice barely audible over the noise. The crying stopped instantly. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear any sign of movement. The silence was deafening, almost suffocating in its weight. Slowly, I unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The basement light was still on, casting long shadows across the stairs. My heart raced as I peered down, half expecting to see something, or someone, waiting for me. But the space was empty. I closed the door quickly, locking it once more. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was someone down there, hiding in the shadows? Or was it something else entirely? The next morning I packed my bags. I couldn't stay in the house any longer, not after what I had experienced. I left a note for the family, explaining that I would return each day to feed and care for the cats, but wouldn't be staying overnight. For the rest of the week, I kept my visits brief, entering the house only long enough to complete my tasks before leaving again. The crying never returned, at least not while I was there. When the family returned, I handed over the keys without mentioning what had happened. I didn't want to scare them or risk sounding crazy. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that basement hadn't wanted me there, and that it was still watching, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor to descend the stairs. What would you have done if you were in this situation? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Years after my unsettling experience with the crying in the basement, I found myself back in the pet-sitting world. By then, I had convinced myself that what had happened in that house was a fluke, a combination of overactive imagination, stress, and a creaky old house. But nothing could have prepared me for what awaited during this next assignment. Jeremy, the pet owner, was a quiet but friendly man in his late 40s. He lived in a modest home tucked away in a secluded neighborhood. He had 2 pets, Ringo, a lively macaw who loved mimicking voices, and a shy black cat named Shadow, who rarely came out from under the furniture. Jeremy assured me that the job would be straightforward. He'd be away for the weekend, and all I had to do was feed the animals, clean Ringo's cage, and keep the cat company. When I arrived, the house seemed unremarkable. It was small but cozy, with worn furniture and walls lined with faded family photos. Jeremy gave me a quick tour, pointing out the essentials and mentioning that the basement was used mostly for storage. "There's no reason to go down there," he said with a chuckle, "unless you're really curious about old junk." I didn't think much of it at the time. I'd dealt with plenty of basements before and was more focused on getting settled in. Jeremy left that afternoon, and I spent the rest of the evening getting to know Ringo, who was surprisingly chatty. He mimicked Jeremy's voice almost perfectly, often repeating phrases like, "Good boy," and "time to eat." Shadow, as expected, stayed hidden. The first night passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake a vague sense of unease. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the rustling of the wind outside. Ringo's cheerful chatter helped ease my nerves, and I eventually fell asleep on the couch with the TV playing softly in the background. The next day I went about my routine without issue. I cleaned Ringo's cage, refilled his food and water, and spent some time coaxing Shadow out from under the bed. By evening I was feeling more comfortable, until I heard it. It started as a faint cracking noise, like the sound of old wood shifting under pressure. At first I assumed it was the house settling, but the sound grew louder, sharper, and more deliberate. It seemed to be coming from the basement. I froze, my heart pounding as I strained to listen. The cracking stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so heavy it felt suffocating. Shaking my head, I tried to dismiss it. It was an old house after all. Old houses made noises. That night I woke to the sound of my bedroom door closing softly. My breath hitched as I sat up, my eyes darting toward the door. It was slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of light from the hallway to spill into the room. I told myself it was the wind, but deep down, I knew better. I crept out of bed and checked on the animals. Ringo was awake, pacing back and forth in his cage. As soon as he saw me, he tilted his head and said, "Daddy's home." The words sent a chill down my spine. Jeremy had mentioned that Ringo often said that when he came home, but Jeremy wasn't supposed to return until the next evening. Swallowing my fear, I checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked. The house was empty, yet the unsettling feeling of being watched lingered. The next morning, I resolved to finish the job and leave as soon as Jeremy returned. I kept busy, avoiding the basement entirely and spending most of my time in the living room with the TV on for background noise. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside my room. My stomach dropped as the footsteps stopped just outside the door. I held my breath, listening intently. The door creaked open slightly and a shadow fell across the floor. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response. The shadow shifted, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. My pulse raced as I jumped out of bed, grabbing my phone and a flashlight. As I stepped into the hallway, I caught sight of something at the end of the corridor, a dark figure standing near the basement door. It was tall and motionless, its features obscured by shadows. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice breaking. The figure didn't move. It stood there, watching me in silence. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. Before I could do anything, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness. I bolted back to my room, locking the door and grabbing my phone to call Jeremy. He didn't pick up, and I was too scared to call the police without knowing what was happening. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and sleeplessness. Every creak of the house sent me into a panic, and I couldn't shake the image of the figure by the basement door. When morning finally came, I packed my things and left without looking back. I left a note for Jeremy, apologizing for leaving early and explaining that I had felt unsafe. Jeremy called me later that day, sounding confused. He insisted that no one else had access to the house and that his brother, who occasionally visited, hadn't been by in months. I didn't argue. I didn't want to know the truth. To this day, I don't know who or what was in that house. But I do know one thing. I'll never take another pet-sitting job in a house with a basement. If this chilling story gave you goosebumps, make sure to subscribe to Nightmare Narratives and hit the bell icon so you never miss another terrifying tale.